I knew something was wrong the moment my son placed the papers in front of me and said, "Just sign, Mom. It's for your safety." People always imagine betrayal arrives with shouting, with slammed doors, with something loud enough to warn you. No. In my life, it has always come quietly, with the softness of a hand that pretends to help while pushing you toward the edge. I sat there, my fingers resting on the pen the way an old bird rests on a thin branch. At 78, I've learned to listen not to the words people say, but to the silence that sits behind them. And the silence behind Michael's voice felt heavy, like someone had forgotten to open a window in a room filled with smoke. He had folded the pages neatly, as if kindness could be arranged with clean edges. "It'll make things easier," he said. "For both of us." His eyes moved too quickly, darting between the papers and my hands, never once stopping on my face. A child looks at you when he wants reassurance. A man looks away when he wants something from you. He knows he shouldn't. So I began reading. Slowly. The way I read everything now. One breath per line. One heartbeat per sentence. I could still smell lunch on the table, the soup I'd cooked with the same quiet routine I'd kept since my husband died. My house felt warm, safe, familiar. And yet each word on those pages rearranged the air around me. Durable power of attorney, financial authority, transfer of rights. At first, the phrases didn't alarm me. I'd seen them before, in brochures at the clinic, in advice columns for seniors. The world loves to treat old people as tasks to be completed, signatures to be obtained before we disappear. But then I reached the paragraph that made my fingertips turn cold. It stated, plainly, almost casually, that upon signing, I granted Michael full control of my accounts, my home, my decisions if he deemed me incapable of managing daily affairs. The sentence curled like a nail driven quietly into wood. I looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell me this part?" He smiled, but it wasn't the smile I knew from the days when he was small and used to run into my arms with scraped knees. This one felt stretched, thin and impatient. "Mom, it's standard. Everyone does it at your age." At my age. Funny how people say those words like they're pulling a curtain over your eyes. "I want to read the rest," I said. He sighed, theatrically. "You don't trust me?" Trust. A heavy word. A word that once lived easily between us. I didn't answer, because answering would have been a kind of confession. Instead, I returned to the text. I found another passage, buried deeper, granting him authority to relocate me to assisted care if necessary. No consent needed. My own signature would be enough to silence me later. Outside the window, a gust of wind shook the dry branches of the old cedar. It made a sound like bones rubbing together. I felt something similar inside me. "You told me this was just for emergencies," I said. "It is. You worry too much." He tapped the pen toward me, as if urging a dog to fetch. "Come on, sign. It'll take 10 seconds. In that moment, I saw not my son, but a man under strain. Someone who needed something from me, urgently, desperately. His knee bounced under the table. His shoulders were stiff. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there last month. "Let me keep this overnight," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Mom, don't start." But I had already started, long before he realized it. A woman my age doesn't survive widowhood, winters, and the slow erosion of her own bones without learning to recognize the scent of danger. And what I smelled now was not care, not protection. It was something closer to a cage being built around me, politely, efficiently, with my own hand as the final piece. I'll read it again later, I said. My eyes get tired. He forced a laugh. Fine, but don't overthink it. When he finally left, the house felt strangely larger, as if the walls themselves had taken a breath. I sat at the table long after the door closed, the papers spread in front of me like a quiet threat. I traced the lines with a fingertip that trembled not from age, but from understanding. And in the dim afternoon light, with no one to witness it, I whispered to myself, "Something isn't right, Evelyn, and you know it." The morning after Michael left, the house felt different. Not quieter, my home has always known silence, but heavier, as if the air had thickened overnight. I woke before the sun, the way I often do now, when sleep slips away from me like a shy animal. I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching the counter, the kettle, the familiar coolness of the sink, grounding myself in things that had not yet changed. I made oatmeal the way I've made it for years, stirring gently, watching the steam curl toward the ceiling. I used to joke that routine is the last loyal companion of old age, but lately even it feels like it watches me, uncertain of how long it can stay. I set my bowl on the table and unfolded the papers again. I didn't need to. I already remembered every troubling line, but something in me wanted to see them in the plain light of morning. Sometimes the truth looks different at dawn, but not this one. It looked even sharper, as if the sunlight had carved it deeper. I read the sentence about relocating me to assisted care, then the one naming him as the sole decision-maker. I tried saying the words out loud, but my voice caught in my throat. Hearing my own breath stumble over them made everything too real. Around 7, I stepped outside to check the mailbox, more out of habit than necessity. The air carried that faint, wet smell the Pacific Northwest keeps tucked under its coat. Across the road, Mrs. Donnelly was trimming her roses, bent slightly, her gloved hands steady despite her 81 years. She waved at me with the clippers. "You're up early," she called. I didn't sleep much. She clucked her tongue. Neither did I. Arthur's knee kept him pacing half the night. We spoke for a few minutes. Polite things, ordinary things. And then, as if she had been waiting for a moment of quiet between us, she lowered her voice. "I saw your son yesterday," she said. "He was talking to a man I've never seen. They were pointing at your house." I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Pointing how? Like they were measuring something. You know, the way realtors do. She shrugged it off as if she didn't want to worry me. Probably nothing. Nothing. People use that word when they don't want to admit something is very much something. I thanked her and walked back inside, carrying the weight of her words like a folded stone in my pocket. I made tea, sat in my armchair, and stared at the sway of branches outside the window. For years that tree has been my calendar, marking the seasons, reminding me of time passing gently. But today it moved with a nervous energy, as if it knew I was watching it for answers. Mid-morning, I took a slow walk to the small grocery store 3 blocks away. I've always liked the rhythm of those walks, the careful placing of my feet, the familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the little bakery on the corner that still uses real butter. The world still behaves normally out there. No documents, no threats disguised as kindness. Just a street, a woman, and time. Inside the store, I picked up bread, milk, and apples, though I didn't need any of them. Sometimes you buy things so you don't have to go home too soon. At the register, the young cashier, Emma, asked how I was doing. She has a way of looking at people that makes them confess more than they mean to. "I'm fine," I said. But she kept watching me, her brow softening. "You look a little tired today," Everything okay? There was a moment, brief, fragile, when I almost told her everything. How ridiculous. A girl barely 20, and me, an old woman clutching groceries like a lifeline. But fear makes you long for listeners in the most unlikely places. I'm just thinking too much, I finally said. When I stepped outside, the clouds had lowered, swollen with rain they hadn't yet decided to release. A car was parked across the street, engine running. A man sat inside, head bent toward his phone. I wouldn't have looked at him twice any other day, but after what Mrs. Donnelly said, I couldn't help noticing the way he lifted his eyes just long enough to watch me walk past. At home, I set the groceries on the counter and took the papers to the living room. I read them again and again. Each time, the words felt less like legal terms and more like hands slowly closing around something I wasn't ready to surrender. By late afternoon, a dull ache settled behind my ribs. Not pain. Fear never shows itself honestly at my age. It hides inside the simple movements, the way I sat down carefully, the way I breathed slower, the way I folded the blanket over my lap even though the room wasn't cold. The day slipped toward evening, and still I hadn't decided what to do. I only knew this. Yesterday, I thought those papers were a misunderstanding. Today, I could no longer pretend that. I sat there until the light faded, the house darkening around me piece by piece, like someone dimming the world one lamp at a time, and I realized I hadn't truly been alone with myself in years. Not like this, with the truth resting quietly between my hands. The next days unfolded with a strange steadiness, the kind that hides trouble underneath its smooth surface. I tried to return to my routines, but everything I did felt slightly off, as if the world had shifted a few inches without telling me. Even my morning tea tasted different, though I used the same cup, the same leaves, the same amount of honey. I suppose fear has its own flavor. Michael began calling more often. At first, he pretended the papers weren't the center of his thoughts. He spoke about the weather, about traffic, about how busy he was at work. But each conversation circled back to the same place, like water finding the lowest point. "Have you looked at the documents again?" he'd ask, voice wrapped in a softness he didn't bother using years ago. "Yes," I would say. "And?" "I'm still reading." He never liked that answer. Patience was never something my son carried well. Even as a boy, he wanted everything finished before it began. As a man, he learned to dress that impatience in politeness, but I could still see it underneath, like a shirt he'd outgrown, but continued to squeeze himself into. By the third call, his tone had changed. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I was standing in my kitchen then, wiping down the counter I'd already cleaned twice. "Harder for whom?" A silence. Then, "Well, for both of us." It was always for both of us. Trouble rarely announces who it truly serves. The small pressures began slipping into the conversations too. Light things, phrased gently, but heavy when they landed. "You've been forgetting appointments lately. I worry about you." "You sounded confused on the phone last week. You shouldn't be alone so much. It's not safe at your age." At your age. The same words again. As if time had become a weapon instead of something I had lived with honestly for nearly 8 decades. One afternoon, he arrived without calling ahead. He used to knock like he meant it, 3 firm taps. This time, he barely touched the door, as if unsure whether he had the right to enter, or already assumed he did. He stepped into my living room with the energy of someone measuring the space rather than visiting it. His gaze skimmed over the mantel, the armchair, the framed photo of his father. He didn't touch anything, but it felt like his eyes did. "Mom?" he said, trying to smile. Trying to... I brought you some groceries. He set the bags on the counter with the pride of a man performing a generous act. Inside were things I don't eat: chicken salad in a plastic tub, overly sweet cereal, a bottle of vitamin supplements. It looked like he'd walked into a store and grabbed whatever was closest, just so he could say he'd helped. You didn't need to do that, I said. You need support, he replied. You've been under stress. And honestly, Mom, you can't handle everything alone anymore. The words slid into the room like cold air seeping through a cracked window. I watched him, really watched him. The tightness in his jaw, the quick shift of his eyes whenever I hesitated. He wasn't here out of kindness. He was here to keep the pressure warm. He sat at the table and pulled the papers from his bag. They were clipped neatly, a new copy. This one is updated, he said. Simpler, just sign this version instead. I didn't touch it. Updated how? Some sections were confusing. I thought it'd help if I streamlined things. Streamlined, as if my life were a set of wires tangled behind a desk. He pushed the pen toward me again, a gentle nudge. I'm trying to take care of you. I kept my hands folded. I haven't asked you to. That's the problem, he snapped, before softening his voice again. Mom, I know you think you're fine, but I see things you don't. Those words stayed with me longer than I wished they would. They followed me as I washed dishes, as I folded laundry, as I swept the porch. I see things you don't. A warning disguised as concern. That evening, while I brought out the trash, Mrs. Donnelly called across the street again. Your son was here earlier, wasn't he? Yes, I answered. She hesitated. I meant to tell you. He asked Arthur last week if he knew any reliable moving companies. Arthur thought maybe you were downsizing. Downsizing. A bitter little word. I stood there, my hands on the cold plastic of the trash bin, watching the last bit of daylight slip behind the cedar. Did he say why? I asked. No. Just that he might need things arranged quickly. Quickly. Another stone dropping quietly into the water. When I went back inside, the house felt suddenly fragile, like something someone could wrap up and take away if they arrived with enough determination. I glanced at the papers on the table. They looked harmless from a distance. White sheets, clean print, nothing aggressive in their shape. But harm rarely comes in shapes. It comes in intentions. I sat down, letting the quiet settle around me. The clock ticked on the wall. The refrigerator hummed. The branches brushed the siding outside with a soft, steady whisper. These were the sounds that had held me together for years. And yet, now, they felt like witnesses. I went to the library the next morning, walking slower than usual, not because my legs were tired, but because my thoughts were heavy and needed space. The building has always been a quiet refuge in this town, one of the few places where no one assumes an old woman must be lost or confused. Books never ask why you're there. They simply wait. Inside, the warmth wrapped itself around me. The smell of paper, old and young, settled into my lungs like something familiar from childhood. Behind the desk sat Harold, who used to work with my husband at the mill decades ago. His hair is thinner now, but his eyes still carry that gentle alertness of a man who has watched life unfold in slow, honest increments. "Morning, Evelyn," he said. "Haven't seen you in a bit." "I've had a few things on my mind," I replied. He nodded, as if he already knew more than I'd said. Harold has a way of noticing the difference between a person being quiet and a person hiding something behind the quiet. "I need some help understanding a legal document," I said. His brows rose, but not out of judgment. Only concern. Bring it here. We moved to a small table near the window. The winter light came in gently, not sharp, like it was trying to be kind to the both of us. I handed him the papers, the original set Michael had given me. Watching Harold read them was strange. He held them like something fragile but dangerous. After a few minutes, he took off his glasses and exhaled slowly. Who gave this to you? My son. Another long breath. He put his glasses back on and pointed to several sections with the edge of his finger. Evelyn, this is not a simple power of attorney. This is full authority. Financial, medical, property, everything. I suspected that, I whispered. It goes beyond that. Look here. He tapped a paragraph halfway down the page. This clause would let him act even if you disagreed, and this one allows him to transfer assets in your name. That includes your house. The room felt suddenly colder. Transfer. Without my approval? Without needing to ask you again, he said. One signature now, and later he decides what happens to your life. Legally. Legally. Such a small word to hold so much threat. I folded my hands in my lap to steady them. Harold, have you seen documents like this before? He nodded slowly. Twice. Both times. It didn't end well for the person who signed. One woman lost her home. Another ended up in a care facility she never wanted because her son said she was struggling. She wasn't. He just needed the money. A tremor moved through me. Quiet. Deliberate. Not panic. Recognition. It matches too many things your son has been doing, Harold added carefully. Pressuring you. Using your age as a reason. Changing the papers. That's not guidance. That's positioning. I looked out the window. A boy rode past on a bicycle, laughing, his jacket unzipped, fearless in the cold. Life moves forward for the young, always outward. For the old, it moves inward, deeper into the places where truth finally refuses to be ignored. I thought maybe I was imagining the danger, I said, that I was being overly suspicious. Harold shook his head. Evelyn, I've known you a long time. You don't imagine things. You observe them. It's different. Something in me settled at those words. Not relief, not certainty, but a quiet permission to trust myself again after years of letting guilt convince me I owed Michael more than caution. Thank you, I said. He gave my hand a brief, warm squeeze. You're not alone. If you need help finding a lawyer to look at this, say so. But whatever you do, don't sign anything. I nodded, folding the papers carefully, as if their edges could cut me. On the walk home, the wind picked up, sharp enough to sting my cheeks. But I didn't hurry. I wanted the time, the space, the cold clarity of it. Each step felt like a decision I had been postponing for too long. By the time I reached my front door, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever my son was building around me, I would not be the one to complete it for him. I spent the next morning sorting through the small stack of mail on my kitchen counter, something I usually do without thinking. But now, every envelope felt like it might be carrying another piece of the truth I hadn't wanted to see. Most of it was harmless: coupons, a church bulletin, a notice about winter road closures. Then I found it. A thin white envelope addressed to Michael, but delivered to my house by mistake. His handwriting was on the forwarding label he must have added himself, which struck me as odd. He rarely forwarded anything. He usually just came by to collect whatever he needed. I shouldn't have opened it, but something in me insisted. Inside was a letter from a bank I didn't recognize, referencing an application for a personal loan. The phrases were careful, formal. Additional collateral may be required. Verification of property ownership. Pending approval. I read the letter twice before folding it back into the envelope. It didn't say my name, but it didn't need to. I could see the shape of the plan, even without the details. Later that afternoon, I drove to Michael's house under the excuse of dropping off a few tools he had loaned me months ago. I wanted to see him, but more than that, I wanted to see the things he wasn't saying. His street was quiet, lined with young families and trimmed lawns. His truck was in the driveway, which surprised me. He always worked late. When I knocked, he opened the door too quickly, as if he'd been waiting. "Mom," he said, "you didn't call." "I was in the neighborhood," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. I stepped inside. The house smelled different, sharp, like stress had a scent. Papers were scattered on the dining table, not neatly arranged, but piled in a hurry. He noticed me looking and moved to block the view, too casually. "What brings you here?" he asked. "I found something in my mailbox, a letter for you." I handed him the envelope. His face stiffened, only slightly, but enough for me to catch it. He slipped it into his back pocket without opening it. "Thanks," he said. "Must have been misdelivered." "What kind of loan are you applying for?" I asked. He froze. "What?" "The letter mentioned collateral." "Mom, that's private." "As private as the documents you want me to sign?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, pretending to busy himself with a glass of water. His silence stretched across the room like a wire pulled too tight. I wandered toward the dining table. I didn't touch anything, just looked. A brochure for home remodeling, a spreadsheet with numbers I couldn't fully see, a checklist labeled timeline. And there, half hidden under a magazine, another document with my address typed neatly across the top. Michael noticed where my eyes had drifted. "Don't," he said sharply. I turned to him. "Are you planning something with my house?" "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" He set the glass down a little too hard. "I'm trying to secure our future, yours too." "My future doesn't require a loan in your name." He rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand the position I'm in." "Then explain it." "I can't," he said, voice cracking with frustration. "Not if you're going to twist everything." I stood there quietly, letting the room settle between us. I wasn't angry, not in the way he expected. What I felt was deeper, older, like watching a crack form in something you had spent a lifetime trying to keep whole. On my way out, I paused by the door. "Michael, did you think I wouldn't notice? Or did you think I wouldn't question you?" He swallowed hard. "I thought you'd trust me." Trust. There it was again, fragile as glass. Outside, the sky hung low with the promise of rain. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my car door. Not from fear this time, from clarity. It is one thing to suspect danger. It is another to see its handwriting scattered across a dining room table. When I got home, I sat in my armchair and closed my eyes. My house, so quiet and familiar, felt different again. Less like shelter, more like something being appraised from afar. I rested my hands on the arms of the chair, steadying myself. Some truths don't arrive with thunder. They gather slowly, piece by piece, until even an old woman can no longer pretend not to see them. Michael came by again 2 days later, unannounced, the way someone does when they believe they still have authority over your time. I was on my porch, sweeping pine needles from the steps. My back hurt, but I've learned to work with pain the way you work with an old neighbor, patiently, without expecting it to improve. When he pulled into the driveway, I felt the broom stiffen in my hands. He walked toward me with a bright smile stretched too thin. "Mom, we need to talk." I nodded, leaning the broom against the railing. A gust of cold wind slipped between us, and for a moment it felt like the air itself wanted to keep him at a distance. Inside, he didn't remove his coat. He paced instead, leaving small arcs in the carpet as if marking territory. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're overwhelmed. You don't want to admit it." "I'm managing," I replied. "That's exactly my point." He stopped pacing and looked at me the way people look at a fragile object they want to replace. "You think you're managing, but you're missing things. Important things." "Such as?" "Bills, appointments." "You've called me 3 times this month with questions you already asked." I knew then he was building something, not a conversation, but a case. "Michael," I said softly, "I'm allowed to repeat myself." "Sure," he said quickly, "but it's a sign, Mom. One of many." He pulled a folder from his coat pocket. When he opened it, I saw printed articles, checklists, highlighted symptoms. "I spoke with someone," he continued, "a specialist. They said it's very common for seniors to lose awareness of their decline." "Decline," I repeated. The word sat strangely in the room, like a cold coin someone dropped onto a warm table. He pushed the folder toward me. "Just read this. I'm not attacking you. I'm trying to prepare you." "I don't need preparing. I need honesty." He frowned. "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're framing things." His jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, as though rehearsing patience he didn't actually feel. "Mom, this is why the paperwork matters. Without it, if something happens, everything becomes complicated. Your house, your accounts, your medical care. I'd have to go through the courts to help you." "Help me," I murmured. "Is that what you're doing?" He sat across from me, elbows on his knees. "I'm trying to protect you, and frankly, you're making it hard." There it was. The shift from persuasion to pressure. I felt it like a hand tightening on my shoulder. He waited for me to look away, but I didn't. "I won't sign anything today," I said. "You said that last time." And it's still true. His face hardened with something like disappointment, but edged with frustration. "You're being stubborn." "I'm being careful. You don't trust me." That sentence hung between us like a rope tied too tightly. I heard the hurt in his voice, but beneath it, something else breathed. Urgency, maybe desperation. "I trust you to be my son," I said. "I don't trust the choices you're making right now." He stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping the floor. "You're going to wait until it's too late. And then what? You expect me to clean up the mess?" "I expect nothing," I answered. My calmness unsettled him. He paced again, rubbing his forehead. "You're going to force my hand," he muttered, almost to himself. "What does that mean?" He froze. Then just as quickly, he smiled. A practiced, shallow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing. Forget it." But I didn't forget, because tone reveals what words try to hide. Before leaving, he walked into the hallway and stared at the framed pictures. Me, him, his father. He touched one lightly, almost absently. "Mom, you're not the woman you used to be." "No one stays the woman they used to be," I replied. He didn't answer. He just opened the door, paused as if wanting to add something, then stepped into the chilled afternoon and drove away. When the sound of his truck faded, the house exhaled. I closed the folder he'd left behind. Page after page listed symptoms: forgetfulness, confusion, difficulty managing finances. I read them slowly, not because they described me, but because they described the version of me he needed. By the time I reached the last page, the sun was low, its light thinning across the carpet. I set the folder aside and rested my hands on my knees. feeling the quiet settle around me. Some sons worry their mothers are losing themselves. Mine seemed worried I wasn't losing myself fast enough. The week moved slowly, the way time does when you're waiting for something you haven't named out loud yet. Each morning, I tried to keep my routine steady, sweeping the porch, feeding the birds, wiping down the kitchen counters, even when they didn't need it. Ritual is a kind of shelter, though sometimes it feels like sweeping the shoreline while the tide keeps rising. On Thursday afternoon, I walked down the street to bring Mrs. Donnelly some muffins I'd baked. She was kneeling by her garden bed, pruning winter branches with the sharp concentration of someone who still believes tending to living things matters, even in the cold months. When she stood up, her knees cracked loudly, and we both laughed. "You haven't been yourself lately," she said, watching me a moment too carefully. "I'm just tired," I replied. "Tired looks different. Yours feels like something you're carrying." I didn't answer. A woman my age learns to withhold certain truths the way she withholds her delicate dishes, only brought out when someone can be trusted not to drop them. Then she said something that made me pause. "Your son was here again on Monday, talking to a man in a black jacket. They were looking at your property line." "My property line?" She nodded. "They measured something with their phones. Arthur thought maybe you were planning renovations." I managed a small smile. "No renovations." She hesitated before adding, "Evelyn, is everything all right with Michael?" For a moment, I felt a strange urge to sit down right there on the cold ground beside her winter roses. Instead, I shook my head gently. "He's under stress. That's all." Her eyes softened, but she didn't push. We said our goodbyes, and I walked home more slowly than usual, each step pressing deeper into the truth I no longer wanted to soften for myself. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the cedar, there was a knock at my door. Not firm, not hesitant, just a steady, polite tapping. When I opened it, I found my neighbor to the left, Maria, the retired nurse. She was in her mid-70s, petite, with eyes that always seemed to see one step further than anyone else's. She held a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. "I made too much," she said. "Take some." She stepped inside, glancing around the way nurses do, checking the subtle signs of a household's health. She set the dish on my counter, then turned to me. "I saw Michael's truck here twice this week," she said quietly. I nodded. He looked tense. "He has a lot going on," I answered. "And you?" she asked. There are people who ask out of habit and people who ask because they're prepared to hear the truth. Maria belonged to the latter. I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the desire to confide paired with the instinct to protect the last scraps of privacy I had. Instead, I said, "He wants me to sign some papers." Her expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition, as if this was a story she'd heard before in other kitchens, other homes, with other aging women who had trusted too deeply. "What kind of papers?" she asked. "Power of attorney? Full rights?" She inhaled sharply. "Evelyn, did he explain why he needs full authority?" "He said it's for my safety." Maria's lips tightened, just slightly. Sons don't use those words unless they want control, not safety. I felt heat rise behind my eyes but blinked it back. "I haven't signed anything." "Good." She walked closer and lowered her voice. "I don't want to alarm you, but be careful. I've seen too many families push someone into decisions they don't understand." "He says I'm forgetting things," I murmured. "That's a tactic," she said gently. "I've heard it before. You're clear. Your mind is strong." The words settled over me like a warm cloth. Not flattery, not pity, an assessment from someone who had spent her life reading truth in the tremor of a hand or the stillness of an eye. She placed her hand on mine. "If he pressures you again, you tell me. You don't have to face this alone." For a moment, I simply stood there, absorbing the rare comfort of being believed without explanation. When she left, I watched her walk across the lawn, her small figure steady against the dimming light. Inside, the house felt less silent than usual. Not louder, but more present, as if walls themselves had drawn closer to listen. I sat at the table, running my fingers along the grain of the wood, tracing every familiar ridge. I didn't know yet how far Michael was willing to go, but for the first time in weeks, I felt the faint outline of something like strength forming inside me, a quiet insistence that I would not face whatever was coming with my head bowed. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite fatigue. More like a knot of questions that had pressed themselves into my chest overnight. I moved slowly through the house, letting the familiar touch of each object calm me. The kettle's handle, the worn fabric of my armchair, the curtain cord that slips so easily between my fingers. But even the small comforts knew they couldn't quiet everything. Maria's words echoed gently but firmly in my mind. "Be careful. I've seen this before." I had too, though not in my own life. Stories whispered among women my age, always told with a slight tremble. But now it wasn't a story. It was my own kitchen, my own son, my own signature waiting to trap me. By noon, I decided to take the papers to someone who could read them without emotion. Someone who would see only the truth, cold and unadorned. There is a small legal clinic downtown, the kind of place where retired attorneys volunteer a few hours a week. I called first. A man named Mr. Hayward said he was available. His voice was measured, steady, not warm, but not rushed. That felt like exactly what I needed. The clinic was inside a converted Victorian house, its walls lined with diplomas and metal filing cabinets that hummed faintly when you walked past. Mr. Hayward met me in a modest room with a large desk and a lamp that cast a soft yellow pool of light. He shook my hand gently, as though he understood the weight of the folder I carried before I even set it down. "What can I help you with, Mrs. Carter?" he asked. I slid the papers toward him. "My son wants me to sign these. He says it's for my safety." He nodded, already reading. His eyes moved steadily, without interruption, without those small, reassuring noises people make when they want you to feel comfortable. He simply read. And the longer he read, the tighter the silence became. When he finally set the papers down, he removed his glasses and looked at me. Not unkindly, but directly. "How old are you, Mrs. Carter?" 78. "And are you managing your daily life? Cooking, cleaning, paying bills?" "Yes," I said. "On some days slowly, but yes." He nodded again. "Then you should not sign this." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone sinking through water. "This is a durable power of attorney with very broad authority," he continued. "It would give your son full control of your finances, property, and medical decisions. Most importantly," he tapped a section with his index finger, "he would have the ability to move you to a care facility without needing additional approval." I felt my pulse thicken in my wrists. He said it was standard. "It is not standard," he said calmly. "Standard documents protect you. This one protects him, entirely." I folded my hands to hide their trembling. Could he sell my home? Yes, he answered. With this, he could. He could also use it as collateral, restructure assets, or transfer ownership. You would still be alive, but legally silent. Legally silent. The phrase settled into my bones. He watched me carefully. Mrs. Carter, has your son pressured you? Suggested you're forgetting things or losing track of responsibilities? I looked at my lap. He says I'm declining. Are you? No, I whispered. Not the way he means. He sat back, exhaling softly through his nose. I've seen this situation many times. Adult children overwhelmed by debt, by ambition, by fear of the future. They convince themselves it's justified. Do you think he means to harm me? No, he said. Not consciously. But intent matters less than capability. And this document gives him far too much. Outside the window, I could hear the faint sound of traffic, the hum of ordinary life continuing its path without me. Inside, the room felt still, heavy with the truth I had come to gather. What should I do? I asked. For now, nothing except this. Do not sign anything. And keep the original with you, somewhere safe. I see. He hesitated, then added gently. If he insists, or if the pressure increases, come back. There are protections for seniors. You are not without power here. The thought startled me. Power. A word I hadn't associated with myself in years. When I left the clinic, the winter light felt sharper, as though the world had been outlined in a thin blade of clarity. I walked slowly to my car, the documents tucked under my arm, no longer confusing or ambiguous. They were exactly what they appeared to be, a quiet attempt to move my life into someone else's hands. At home, I set the papers on the table, smoothing the edges with my palm. And for the first time since this began, I felt the faint stirrings of something close to resolve, small but steady, taking shape inside my chest. The next few days passed with a quiet unease, the kind that settles into the corners of a house and waits. I noticed things I hadn't before. How long Michael stared at me when we spoke. How he repeated questions as if comparing my answers. How he brought up my age the way someone slips a stone into a pocket, small but deliberate. One morning, while I made tea, the phone rang. It was a woman from the clinic where I'd had a routine checkup months earlier. Her voice was bright, professional, but she hesitated before explaining why she called. Your son contacted us, she said. He asked if we had any notes regarding cognitive concerns. I felt the warmth drain from my hands. Concerns? I repeated. She cleared her throat. We told him your chart showed nothing of that nature. He insisted something must have been missed. I closed my eyes. Did he say why he needed that information? A family planning matter, he said. But he asked twice, rather insistently. After we hung up, I stood at the counter for a long time, holding the phone as if it contained a truth I didn't want to swallow. It wasn't just the papers now. He was gathering evidence, manufactured or not, to build a picture of me that suited his needs. Later that afternoon, I walked to the backyard to take in some air. The cedar branches were shaking in a cold wind, whispering that same brittle sound I'd begun to recognize as warning. I leaned against the railing, feeling the familiar ache in my hip. And then I remembered something else, small but suddenly sharper, in my mind. 2 weeks ago, Michael had casually asked, Mom, do you ever lose track of time? Forget what day it is? At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now I heard the intention behind it. He wasn't checking on me. He was documenting me. That evening, Maria stopped by again under the excuse of returning a dish I hadn't realized I'd lent her. She stayed at the doorway a moment too long, studying my face. You look troubled, she said. Michael has been asking questions, I replied. Not to me, to doctors. Her expression sharpened. About your memory? I nodded. She stepped inside without waiting for invitation, lowering her voice. Evelyn, listen to me. When I worked in the hospital, I saw families push for cognitive evaluations to justify taking control. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes it was not. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Why would he go that far? People under financial pressure do foolish things, she said. Sometimes cruel things. Cruel. The word didn't fit my son. Not the boy I raised, not the man I imagined he had become. But the man standing in my living room with revised legal documents? That was someone else entirely. Has he mentioned guardianship? She asked. No, I said. But he's preparing the ground. She squeezed my shoulder gently. You need to protect yourself now, not later. After she left, I found myself walking through the house as though seeing it from someone else's eyes. Its small imperfections, its age, its quiet. These walls had held my life for decades. I knew suddenly, with a clarity that startled me, that Michael saw them not as my home, but as leverage. When I reached the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap. The room was dim, the last bit of dusk settling softly across the quilt I'd sewn years ago. I listened to my own breathing, slow but steady. I wasn't losing myself. He was trying to erase me before I even had the chance. The morning after Maria's visit, I woke with the kind of clarity that doesn't feel like courage, but something quieter, older, like a door inside me had finally closed, gently, but firmly. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me and laid out everything I knew. The papers, the loan letter, the clinic call, the questions meant to paint me as someone fading. Piece by piece, the picture became unmistakable. Michael was preparing to take control of my life, so I would prepare to defend it. I found my old notebook in the drawer near the stove. The cover was worn, the pages slightly curled. It had held shopping lists, garden notes, and reminders for decades. Today, it would hold something different. I wrote a single line at the top. What I must do now. The first item was simple. Find a lawyer of my own. Not the clinic, not advice over a counter, but someone who understood exactly what these situations could become. I searched the phone directory, not online, I never trusted that much, and found a small firm 2 towns over that specialized in elder rights. The name felt steady. Whitman and Boyd. I called. A woman answered, listened without interrupting, then said, "We can see you tomorrow morning." The next item, secure my documents. I gathered everything Michael had ever given me, plus my will, my deed, my medical directives. I placed them in a folder and hid them in the linen closet, behind the heavy blankets no one used but me. Not out of paranoia, out of prudence. Sometimes survival at my age is simply knowing where things cannot be easily found. By midday, as the sun pushed through the clouds in thin, pale ribbons, I took a slow walk around my home. I touched the walls, the window frames, the edge of the dining table where my husband once rested his hand while thinking. This house had shaped me, held me together through losses I never spoke about. And now I realized I wasn't just fighting for control of paperwork. I was fighting for the right to remain myself in the place that still remembered me clearly. In the afternoon, Michael called again. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom, you sound tired," he said too quickly. "I'm fine." "You really shouldn't be alone so much. I've been thinking, maybe we should schedule a cognitive evaluation. Just to be safe." "No," I said, calm as the surface of a pond. "That won't be necessary." He paused. "You're resisting everything I'm trying to do." "I'm considering everything. I corrected. There's a difference. He sighed loudly. This is exactly why the paperwork is important. You're struggling. I'm not the one struggling, Michael. The silence after that was sharp enough to hear. I'll come by tonight, he said. No, I replied. Not tonight. His voice tightened. Why not? Because I'm busy. Doing what? Living my life, I said, and hung up before he could answer. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself no one had asked for in years. That evening, I prepared for my meeting with the lawyer. A tidy stack of documents, a list of questions written in my notebook, and the calm certainty that this was not disloyalty. This was self-preservation. As the sky dimmed into the soft blue of early night, I sat by the window, feeling the quiet strength settling into my bones. The house hummed around me, familiar and sure, as if it understood the shift taking place inside its walls. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing to stop surrendering. The next morning, I drove to Whitman and Boyd, gripping the steering wheel more firmly than I had in years. The office sat in a quiet brick building beside a hardware store, the kind of place where nothing rushed and everything stayed exactly where it had been the day before. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a warm nod and directed me to a small room lined with law books that carried the faint scent of dust and patience. Mr. Boyd arrived a few minutes later, a calm man in his early 60s, with a slow, considerate way of speaking. He listened as I explained the situation, interrupting only to clarify dates or details. When I finished, he folded his hands on the table. Mrs. Carter, he said, your instincts are correct. You need protection in writing before your son pushes further. What kind of protection? I asked. We start with two things, he said. First, a new power of attorney, naming someone you trust, not your son. Second, updates to your will and property documents to block unauthorized transfers. And then, he opened the folder I'd brought. We make sure everything Michael gave you is documented as pressure, not consent. I felt a slow breath release from my chest, as if untying a knot I hadn't realized was pulling so tight. He walked me through each form carefully, speaking not like a lawyer, but like a teacher. A durable power of attorney on my terms, naming an independent fiduciary. A healthcare directive that required my own signature for any major decision unless I was medically proven incapable. A protective note filed with the county to prevent unauthorized property action. Piece by piece, the cage Michael had tried to build loosened. Your son cannot override these, Mr. Boyd said. Not without a court finding of incapacity, and given your clarity, that's unlikely. Clarity. The word steadied me more than the paperwork itself. When everything was signed, he looked at me with a quiet seriousness. Mrs. Carter, I want you to understand something. Children sometimes act out of fear. Fear of losing a parent. Fear of financial ruin. Fear of responsibility. But fear doesn't excuse coercion. I raised him better than this, I murmured. You raised him to know your strength, he said. He just hoped you'd forgotten it. I left the office with a folder heavier than it should have been, but my steps felt lighter. Outside, the winter air was crisp, almost bracing. I stood beside my car for a moment, letting the cold settle into my cheeks. It sharpened everything, my thoughts, my resolve, my sense of myself. At home, I stored the new documents where only I knew to look. I wrote the date on a slip of paper and tucked it inside my notebook beneath the line that read, "What I must do now." Then I sat at the kitchen table, letting the quiet return in its familiar shape. Not oppressive, not uncertain, just mine. Later that afternoon, while sweeping the hallway, I caught sight of my reflection in the narrow mirror. My hair had thinned, my shoulders sloped more than they once did, but my eyes, those were the same. Clear, steady, not confused, not fading. For the first time since all this began, I felt something warm rise inside me. Not hope, exactly, but recognition. I had not surrendered. I had not signed away my life. And whatever came next, I would meet it standing, not shrinking. Michael came over the next evening, this time without calling, as if the boundaries between our lives had already dissolved in his mind. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the familiar rumble of his truck, a sound that once meant comfort, but now arrived like an announcement of disruption. He knocked once and let himself in before I could answer. "Mom," he said, stepping inside with an energy too sharp for my quiet house. "We need to talk." I didn't stop folding the towel in my hands. "I'm listening." He watched me for a moment, his eyes scanning my face the way a doctor checks for signs of illness. "You're avoiding me." "No," I said calmly. "I'm giving myself space." "That's the same thing," he snapped, then softened his voice again. "Mom, I'm trying to help you, but you're making it impossible." He sat down heavily, pulling out the same folder he'd been carrying for weeks. This time, he placed it on the coffee table with a kind of finality, as if it were the answer to a question I hadn't asked. "I spoke with a social worker," he began. "She said there are programs for seniors who struggle with decision-making. I told her you might need an evaluation." I felt the air around me shift, cool and sharp. "Without asking me?" He rubbed his forehead. "You're not seeing the bigger picture. If you decline, and you might, someone has to be able to support you." "I'm not declining," I said evenly. "You think that," he countered. "But you don't see the changes the way I do." He began listing things. Misplaced receipts, repeated questions, the time I paused too long before answering him on the phone. Each example was tiny on its own, but he stacked them carefully, like stones meant to build a narrative. "I'm worried about you," he concluded, "and I won't apologize for that. Worry can be love, but it can also be strategy. At my age, you learn the difference." "What is it you want from me, Michael?" I asked. "I want you safe," he said, "and I want the paperwork signed." There it was, the truth stripped of its soft wrapping. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap. "Why are you in such a hurry?" "Because things can change fast," he said. "One fall, one bad day, and suddenly everything becomes complicated. I don't want to end up in court fighting strangers just to take care of my own mother." "You're not taking care of me now," I replied gently. "You're trying to control me." His face tightened. "I can't believe you'd say that." He stood and began pacing the room, the same frustrated rhythm I'd watched since he was a teenager. "I'm under a lot of pressure," he muttered. "You don't know what my life is like." "Then tell me," I said. But he didn't. Instead, he stopped in front of the window, staring out into the dimming yard. "If you'd just sign," he said quietly, "all of this would get easier." "For whom?" He didn't answer. When he finally turned back toward me, something unguarded flickered across his face. Fear, not for me, but for himself. It lasted only a second before he pulled his composure back into place. "You're forcing me to consider other options," he said. I felt the words settle deep inside my chest. Not a threat, exactly. A warning. "You can consider whatever you need," I replied, my voice steady. "But I won't sign." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, as if trying to recognize the woman sitting in front of him. Perhaps he remembered the years when my voice bent easily around his needs. But age doesn't always soften. Sometimes it clarifies. Without another word, he gathered his folder, walked to the door, and left. The house grew still again, settling into itself after the disturbance. I returned to the laundry, folding the last towel slowly, pressing the edges flat with my fingertips. Strength doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it's just the refusal to hand your life to someone who hasn't earned the right to hold it. I spent the next morning going through my house with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. Not hurried, not frightened, just steady, determined. I moved from room to room, opening drawers, sorting through papers, studying corners where I'd tucked things away for later, though later had a way of sneaking up quietly. It was in the small desk in the hallway, my husband's old desk, that I found the first piece. A stack of envelopes rubber-banded together, all addressed to Michael. He must have used my address again. I sat down and opened them one by one. Most were routine notices, but 3 were different. Warnings from lenders, mentioning overdue accounts, consolidation offers, and one phrase repeated across them: secured asset required. I didn't need a lawyer to explain what that meant. The second piece came almost by accident. While dusting his childhood bookshelf, I found a slim spiral notebook tucked behind a row of old paperbacks. Not mine. His handwriting slanted across the first page, rushed, uneven, the way he wrote when he was under pressure. I hesitated, then opened it. Dates, phone numbers, notes about home values in my neighborhood. A list titled Steps, each line short and sharp. Talk to social worker. Confirm capacity requirements. Get POA signed. Appraisal appointment. Loan approval after title transfer. My hands didn't tremble. Instead, a quiet calm settled over me, as if the truth had been waiting for permission to show itself. Later in the day, when I walked to the mailbox, I found another letter incorrectly delivered to me. This one was from a financial planner, confirming a consultation with Michael about integrating inherited real property into long-term restructuring. The date was next week. He hadn't even bothered to move it to his house first. In his mind, the outcome must have already been certain. I slipped the letter into my coat pocket and kept walking around the yard, letting the cold steady my breathing. I knew now, without question, that he hadn't just stumbled into desperation. He had arranged it, carefully, quietly, believing I wouldn't look too closely. Maria stopped by in the afternoon, as she sometimes did when she saw me outside. "You're out early," she said. "I needed the air," I replied. She studied my face with that quick, sharp intuition nurses carry like an extra sense. "You found something?" I nodded. Enough to understand his intentions clearly. She didn't ask what. Instead, she placed her hand over mine. "I'm sorry." I appreciated that more than questions. Sorry acknowledges the weight without demanding you lift it again to prove it exists. After she left, I returned to the house and laid everything out on the kitchen table. The letters, the notes, the documents. A small constellation of choices he'd made, each point connected to the next with a line of quiet determination. Not to hurt me, perhaps, but to use me. And that distinction, thin as a thread, had finally snapped. As the afternoon light faded, I gathered the papers into an orderly stack and placed them in my notebook, behind the line that once read, "What I must do now." It felt different looking at it this time. Not a plea, not a list of tasks, but a record of someone who refused to be erased. I closed the notebook gently, smoothing the cover with my palm, and felt the weight of every page settle into place. Some truths are too heavy to carry loosely. They must be held with both hands. Michael arrived on Sunday afternoon, as if Sundays still meant something to us. He didn't call, just walked up the driveway, with the same determined stride he used as a boy when he wanted something he wasn't supposed to have. I watched him through the window for a moment, letting myself feel the weight of everything I now knew and everything I had chosen to protect. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting. "Mom, we need to finish this," he said. There was no greeting, no softness. He carried a small stack of papers, thinner this time but more deliberate, like a final attempt sharpened to a point. "Sit," he said gently, the way one speaks to someone fragile. I remained standing. He sighed. "I don't want to fight. I just want you safe. I've talked to people who know this stuff, and the sooner we sign, the better." I met his eyes, and for the first time, he looked away first. "Michael," I said, "I know about the loan applications." His shoulders tensed. "What loan applications?" "The ones requiring collateral, the ones mentioning property." He opened his mouth, but I continued. "I also found your notebook, and the letters from lenders, and the consultation you scheduled to discuss transferring my house." Color drained from his face, leaving him strangely young-looking, stripped of the practiced confidence he'd been carrying. "You went through my things," he said sharply. "You left your things in my home," I replied. "And I'm allowed to understand the future you were planning for me." "That's not fair," he whispered. "No," I said. "What you planned wasn't fair." He sat down heavily, the papers sagging in his hand. "I'm drowning, Mom. You don't understand. I can't keep up. The mortgage, the debts, the business. I thought if I could stabilize things, if I could secure something, by taking my home," I finished for him. "I thought you'd be safer in a facility," he said weakly. "You're alone here. You fall behind on things. You forget things." I shook my head. "I forget small things, not myself, not my life, and not what you were trying to do." He pressed his palms together, leaning forward. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I believe that," I said, "but intention doesn't soften the outcome." Silence settled between us, thick as winter fog. I sat across from him, folding my hands, steadying my breath. "Michael," I said gently, "I met with an attorney." His head jerked up. "I've updated my will. I've assigned my own power of attorney. Everything is protected. You cannot make decisions for me. Not now, not later." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. He looked as if I had struck him, not with anger, but with something deeper, a kind of stunned disbelief. "You don't trust me at all," he said quietly. "I trust you to be human," I replied. "And humans make desperate choices when backed into corners." He stared at the floor, and for a moment, I almost saw the boy he once was, the child who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms shook the windows. But years reshape people, and love does not erase responsibility. Finally, he whispered, "What do you want me to do?" "Live your life," I said. "Solve your problems without using mine to fix them." He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. He gathered his papers, hands unsteady, and stood. At the door, he paused. "Mom, I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was the simple truth he needed to hear." After he left, I closed the door quietly and rested my hand against the wood. The house felt still again, not like something threatened, but like something reclaimed. I walked to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and let the calm settle around me. For several days after Michael left, the house felt unusually calm, as if it had been holding its breath for weeks and could finally exhale. I moved through the rooms slowly, letting the silence settle back into its familiar shape. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing needed to. Life rarely ends with an explosion. More often it changes in the quiet that follows a hard truth. I woke early each morning, made my tea, and sat by the window watching the cedar branches sway with their steady old patience. The world outside continued as it always had. Cars passing, dogs barking, the mailman humming to himself as he walked the route he's known for decades. It all reminded me that my life, even at 78, still belonged to me. Not as a gift, not as a burden, simply as a fact. 3 days later, Michael called. The ring startled me, habit, not fear. But I waited a moment before answering. His voice was softer, smaller. "Mom, I'm giving you space, like you asked." "I appreciate that," I said. "I won't bring up the papers again," he added. "I know." There was a pause, the kind that forms when two people are trying to step across a distance they created together. "I'll figure things out," he said. "My debts, all of it. I shouldn't have dragged you into it." "You're my son," I replied. "You don't have to hide your struggles, but you can't solve them with pieces of my life." Another pause. Then, quietly, "I understand." When the call ended, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only a steady clarity, the kind that arrives after finally telling the truth out loud. I sat for a long time, letting the moment settle inside me. Age doesn't make a person fragile. It simply strips away the need to pretend. Later that afternoon, I took out my notebook, the same one that had held my doubts, my plans, my evidence. I wrote a single line under the last entry. I chose myself. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pride. It was recognition. For years, I'd let my love for my son blur the edges of my own needs, convince me that sacrifice was the same as care. But sacrifice can become a habit, and habits can become cages if you never stop to ask whether you are still needed inside them. That evening, I walked through the house with the windows open just enough to let in the early spring air. The rooms felt lighter, as if they approved of the decisions made within them. I touched the walls the way one touches the shoulder of an old friend, reassuring, grateful. This house had seen me through grief, quiet victories, long winters, and now this strange late chapter of reclaiming myself. As the sun lowered, painting the sky in soft strips of rose and gray, I sat in my armchair and let the light rest on my hands. They have grown thin over the years, but they still hold things firmly when needed. You don't stop being strong just because people expect you to. Strength can be quiet. It can be choosing not to sign a paper. It can be telling your child no without raising your voice. It can be sitting alone in your own home and knowing you earned the right to stay. When the last of the daylight faded, I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply. Not relief, just presence. Just the fullness of my own life returning to its rightful place. And if anyone reading this finds themselves in the same quiet corner I stood in, wondering if their voice still matters, let me tell you gently, it does. It always does. If this story reminds you of your own, don't stay silent. Share it, speak it, or simply whisper it to someone who will listen. Your truth deserves a place in the light.